You are listening to Whispers Beneath the Blossoms. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 1. Petals of a Forgotten Promise. The breeze carried the scent of cherry blossoms, soft and sweet, like a memory just out of reach. Petals floated lazily through the air, dancing with the wind before settling gently on the worn wooden benches that lined the school courtyard. Emma Parker sat beneath the largest tree, her sketchbook balanced carefully on her lap, fingers lightly smudged with graphite. She didn't mind. Art had always been messy, a reflection of life itself. Her pencil moved effortlessly across the page, tracing the delicate curves of the blossoms above her. She shaded the petals with the softest strokes, capturing their fragile beauty as they teetered on the edge of blooming and falling. The branches stretched wide, a canopy of pink and white that painted the sky in hues of fleeting wonder. But her mind was elsewhere. Emma's gaze drifted to the far end of the courtyard where Ryan Bennett stood, leaning against the brick wall near the vending machines. His eyes were downcast, fixed on his phone, but Emma doubted he was really reading anything. His shoulders, once broad and confident, now slouched with a weight she couldn't quite understand. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Ryan would have been sitting next to her, making sarcastic comments about her artistic obsession with cherry blossoms. He used to tease her about how she drew the same tree every spring, calling it nature's Groundhog Day. But Emma had loved those moments, the banter, the laughter, and the quiet comfort that came with knowing he was always there. Not anymore. Ryan had changed, or maybe life had changed him. Emma tried to push the thought away, focusing on the sketch in front of her. But her mind betrayed her, dragging her back to a memory she had tucked away long ago. 5 years ago. The cherry blossoms had been in full bloom that day too. Emma and Ryan, just 12 at the time, had raced to the tree after school, their backpacks discarded carelessly at the base. They had spent the entire afternoon making up silly stories about the magical tree that granted wishes when the petals fell. "I wish we'll always be friends," Ryan had said, his voice full of certainty. Emma had laughed, pressing her pinky against his. "Promise. Promise," he'd whispered, his brown eyes reflecting the sunlight filtering through the blossoms. "Well." Emma blinked, returning to the present as a stray petal landed on her sketchbook. She brushed it away, her heart heavy with the realization that promises made beneath cherry blossoms didn't always last. "Still obsessed with that tree, huh?" The familiar voice startled her, but she didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Lily." Emma smiled softly as her best friend dropped onto the bench beside her. Lily Thompson was the polar opposite of Emma in almost every way. Where Emma was quiet and introspective, Lily was vibrant and outspoken. Her bright auburn hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her hazel eyes sparkled with curiosity as she glanced at Emma's sketch. "You could draw that thing with your eyes closed," Lily teased, nudging her gently. "Why not sketch something new for once?" Emma smirked, but her eyes wandered back to Ryan. He hadn't moved. "Ah." Lily followed her gaze, her expression softening. "Ryan again?" Emma sighed, closing her sketchbook with a quiet snap. "It's not like that." "Sure it's not," Lily murmured, but her tone was laced with understanding. "You miss him." "I don't even know him anymore." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "We used to talk about everything. Now, it's like there's this wall between us." Lily leaned back, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Have you tried talking to him?" Emma gave a half-hearted shrug. "I've tried. But he's distant. And I don't want to push." Lily's smile was gentle but knowing. "Maybe he's waiting for you to break through that wall." Emma wasn't so sure. Ryan had built that wall brick by brick, and she didn't know if she had the strength or the right to tear it down. Across the courtyard, Ryan's mind was anything but calm. He could feel Emma's eyes on him even when he pretended not to notice. Part of him wanted to go to her, to sit beside her and fall back into the easy rhythm they once had. But another part, one that had grown louder in the past year, told him it was better this way. Ryan's jaw clenched as he stared at the unopened message from his father. "Dad, did you sign up for the engineering workshop? The deadline's today." Ryan's stomach twisted. His father's words weren't a question. They were an expectation. And Ryan was tired of living under the weight of those expectations. His gaze drifted toward Emma. She looked so at peace beneath the cherry blossoms, her pencil dancing across the page with effortless grace. He remembered how she used to drag him into her world of imagination, making him believe in things that felt impossible. But Ryan didn't believe in possibilities anymore. Ryan. His heart skipped at the sound of her voice. Emma was standing in front of him now, her expression hesitant but hopeful. "Hey," he mumbled, shoving his phone into his pocket. "Hey." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I was just wondering if you're coming to the Cherry Blossom Festival this weekend." Ryan hesitated. The festival had always been their thing, a tradition they'd kept for years. But this year felt different. He felt different. "I don't know," he said, his voice distant. "I've got stuff." Emma's smile faltered, but she masked it quickly. "Right. Of course. I just thought I'd ask." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned to leave. "Emma." She paused, her back to him, but didn't turn around. "Why do you still draw that tree?" Emma's breath caught, but she didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because some things are worth holding on to." Ryan watched her walk away, her words echoing in his mind. But as the petals fell around him, Ryan wondered if he had already let go. Emma's footsteps echoed softly along the empty hallway as she made her way toward the art room after school. The usual bustle of students had died down, leaving only a quiet hum of distant chatter from the remaining clubs and extracurriculars. She had promised herself she wouldn't let Ryan's distance bother her, but her mind refused to cooperate. "Why do you still draw that tree?" His words had echoed in her mind all afternoon, tugging at a part of her heart she had tried to ignore. "Because some things are worth holding on to." She hadn't planned to say that. It had just slipped out. But it was the truth. Emma pushed open the door to the art room, her sanctuary. The scent of paint and paper filled the air, grounding her. Rows of half-finished projects lined the tables, but her usual spot by the window remained untouched. Sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a warm glow on her sketchbook, which she had left behind earlier in her haste to escape Ryan's gaze. She sat down, running her fingers lightly over the worn edges of the pages. The sketch she had started earlier, a delicate outline of cherry blossoms, stared back at her. But now the branches looked incomplete, as if something was missing. "Why can't I just let go?" she murmured under her breath. "Talking to yourself again, Parker?" Emma startled, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to see Mr. Adams, her art teacher, leaning against the doorway with a knowing smile. "Sorry," she said, offering a sheepish grin. "Just lost in thought." Mr. Adams walked over, his eyes falling on her sketch. "Cherry blossoms again?" Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the petals. "They're familiar." "Familiar is safe," he said gently, pulling out a chair beside her. "But sometimes holding on too tightly keeps you from seeing what's ahead." Emma's eyes flickered up to meet his. Mr. Adams had a way of seeing beyond her words, and it was both comforting and unnerving. "Is this about Ryan?" he asked softly. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I don't know how to fix things. It's like, he's built this wall and I don't know if I'm supposed to knock it down or just walk away." Mr. Adams leaned back, folding his arms. "Maybe it's not about knocking the wall down. Maybe it's about showing him that he doesn't have to hide behind it." Emma's brow furrowed. "But what if he doesn't want me there anymore?" Mr. Adams smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Sometimes people push away the ones they care about the most because they're afraid of being seen." Emma's heart clenched at his words. "Give him time," Mr. Adams added. "But don't stop being there. Sometimes just knowing someone's still standing on the other side of the wall, that's enough." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line as she looked back at her sketch. The petals seemed more fragile now, as if they could be blown away by the slightest breeze. "Thanks, Mr. Adams." "Anytime, Parker." He stood, patting her shoulder gently before heading toward the door. "And don't forget, cherry blossoms don't last forever. But that's what makes them beautiful." Across town, Ryan stood at the edge of the local park, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The cherry blossom tree they had claimed as their own still stood tall, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. Pink petals floated down like whispers from the past, stirring memories he had tried so hard to bury. Ryan's jaw clenched as he stared up at the blossoms. The promise they had made beneath that tree felt like a lifetime ago. I wish we'll always be friends. His 12-year-old self had believed in that promise. But life had a way of shattering childhood dreams. Ryan. The sound of his father's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Ryan turned to see his father approaching, his expression as stern as ever. Robert Bennett was a man of few words, but his silence often spoke louder than anything. "I've been calling you," his father said, his tone clipped. "Sorry. I was thinking." "Thinking doesn't get you into college," his father replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you sign up for the engineering workshop?" Ryan's stomach twisted. "Not yet," he mumbled, looking away. "Ryan." His father's tone was sharper now. "The deadline is today. This is your future we're talking about." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to meet his father's gaze. "What if I don't want to go into engineering?" A flicker of annoyance flashed in his father's eyes. "We've talked about this. Engineering is stable. It's secure. You can't waste your potential chasing uncertainty." Ryan's hands clenched into fists. "And what if I don't want to spend the rest of my life doing something I hate?" His father's expression hardened. "You're being reckless, Ryan. You're not a child anymore. It's time to start thinking like an adult." Ryan's throat tightened, but he didn't argue. There was no point. His father had already made up his mind about Ryan's future. "I'll sign up," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His father gave a curt nod as if that was the only acceptable answer. "Good. We'll talk more about this later." As his father walked away, Ryan's shoulders sagged, the weight of expectations pressing down on him once more. He looked back at the cherry blossom tree, the branches swaying gently as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the petals. "Some things are worth holding on to." Emma's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a long while Ryan wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was holding on to the wrong things. The weekend arrived faster than Emma expected. The annual Cherry Blossom Festival was in full swing, and the town square was buzzing with life. Stalls lined the streets, offering everything from handmade crafts to cotton candy. Children laughed as they chased bubbles, and couples strolled beneath the canopy of pink and white petals that fluttered down like confetti. But Emma's heart wasn't in it. She stood by the old tree, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the crowd. Ryan was nowhere to be seen. "Still hoping he'll show up?" Lily's voice broke through her thoughts. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. Maybe." Lily gave her a sympathetic smile. "You're braver than I am. I don't think I could keep hoping like this." Emma's gaze drifted back to the tree, her heart aching. I can't give up on him." Lily squeezed her arm gently. "Then don't." But as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the petals fell like whispers of forgotten promises, Emma couldn't help but wonder. Was she holding on to something that was already gone?
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Whispers Beneath the Blossoms. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 2. Shadows Between Us. The Cherry Blossom Festival had ended 2 days ago, but its lingering remnants clung to the town like a fading dream. Petals still danced across the sidewalks, carried by the wind, and the air was laced with the faint sweetness of the blossoms. But for Emma, the festival had felt hollow without Ryan. She sat by the window of her favorite coffee shop, the Brew Corner, watching the world go by. A half-empty cup of iced coffee sat on the table beside her sketchbook, which lay open to yet another drawing of the old cherry blossom tree. The branches stretched across the page, but she had left the space beneath them empty. No figures, no memories. Her mind kept replaying the moment at the festival when she had waited by the tree, hoping Ryan would show up. But he hadn't. Still nothing. Emma glanced up to see Lily sliding into the chair across from her, a caramel latte in hand. Her friend's expression was gentle but laced with concern. "Not a word," Emma murmured, tapping her pencil against the edge of the sketchbook. "It's like he's just gone." Lily frowned, stirring her latte absent-mindedly. "Maybe he just needs more time. You know how Ryan is. He shuts down when he's overwhelmed." Emma's eyes drifted back to the sketch. "But how long am I supposed to wait?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lily was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "Emma, maybe it's not about waiting. Maybe You need to make him see that he doesn't have to go through whatever this is alone. Emma sighed, her fingers tightening around her pencil. And how do I do that when he won't even talk to me? Lily's lips pressed together and for a moment neither of them spoke. Maybe, Lily started hesitantly, you should go see him. Emma's head snapped up. What? Go to his house, Lily said softly. You've known him forever, Em. Used to spend hours there after school. Maybe, if you're there he won't be able to push you away. Emma's heart pounded at the thought. It felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure Ryan wanted her to cross. But then again, if she didn't do something, they might slip so far apart that they wouldn't be able to find their way back. Do you really think it's a good idea? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily's eyes softened. I think, if anyone can get through to Ryan, it's you. Ryan's house felt different. Emma stood on the porch, her hand hovering just above the doorbell. The house had always felt like a second home when they were younger. Warm, familiar, filled with laughter and shared secrets. But now, standing there, the air felt heavier, as if the walls carried the weight of unspoken words. Her fingers brushed against the bell, but she hesitated. What if he doesn't want to see me? The doubt gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Emma pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house and her heart pounded in her ears. For a moment nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. Emma. Mrs. Bennett stood in the doorway, surprise etched across her face. Her usually warm smile was dimmed by something Emma couldn't quite place. Hi, Mrs. Bennett, Emma said softly, trying to mask her nerves. Is Ryan home? Mrs. Bennett's expression faltered, and she glanced over her shoulder before stepping aside. He's upstairs. But Emma, he's been distant lately. Emma's throat tightened, but she nodded. I know. Mrs. Bennett gave her a small, understanding smile. Maybe, he just needs a reminder that someone still cares. Emma's feet felt heavy as she climbed the stairs, each step echoing louder than it should have. Her mind was racing, trying to find the right words, but nothing felt right. When she reached Ryan's door, she paused, her hand hovering over the knob. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see him sitting at his desk, his back to her. The room was dimly lit, with only the glow of his laptop illuminating the space. Papers were scattered across the desk and his headphones rested beside them. But it was the slumped curve of his shoulders that made Emma's heart ache. Ryan. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a whisper through the still air. Ryan's head jerked up and he turned, his eyes widening when he saw her standing in the doorway. Emma. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. Hey, she said softly, stepping inside. I hope it's okay that I came by. Ryan blinked, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emma thought he might ask her to leave. But instead he ran a hand through his hair, sighing softly. Why are you here? His tone wasn't cold, but there was a guardedness to it that made Emma's heart clench. I was worried about you, she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been avoiding me. Ryan's jaw tightened and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'm not avoiding you. Ryan. Her voice was gentle, but it held a quiet plea that made his shoulders tense. Then why won't you talk to me? She asked softly, stepping closer. Ryan was silent for a long moment, his eyes glued to the ground. Because I don't know how to, he finally murmured. Emma's brow furrowed as she knelt beside his chair, her hand brushing lightly against his. What's going on, Ryan? His eyes flickered to hers, and for a brief moment the wall he had built cracked. Emma saw the hurt, the fear, and the confusion swirling beneath the surface. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Em. His voice was barely above a whisper, his gaze dropping again. Dad, he's pushing me toward engineering, but I don't even know if that's what I want. Emma's heart clenched. She had seen the pressure his father put on him, but she hadn't realized how much it was weighing him down. Ryan. I feel like I'm suffocating, he admitted, his voice breaking. And I didn't want to drag you into it. Emma's fingers tightened around his. You're not dragging me into anything, Ryan. I'm already here. His eyes finally met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Emma saw a glimmer of vulnerability in his gaze. Why? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma's heart pounded as she leaned in slightly, her thumb brushing gently over his knuckles. "Because I care," she said softly. "And because I made a promise under that tree, remember?" Ryan's breath hitched, and for a moment the weight between them felt lighter. "You don't have to go through this alone, Ryan," she whispered. "I'm still here, if you'll let me be." Silence hung between them, heavy and fragile as Ryan's walls began to crumble. And for the first time in a long time, he let her in. Ryan didn't say anything for a while. His gaze stayed locked on their intertwined hands, as if he was afraid that looking at her would shatter whatever fragile thing had begun to rebuild between them. Emma could feel the tension in the air, thick and unyielding. But she didn't pull away. She stayed right there, her thumb gently brushing against his knuckles, a silent promise that she wasn't going anywhere. "I didn't want to disappoint you," Ryan finally whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustling of the cherry blossom petals outside. Emma's heart ached at the weight in his words. "Disappoint me?" she asked softly, her brows furrowing. "Ryan, you could never." "I could," he interrupted, his voice laced with quiet anguish. His eyes lifted, and when they met hers they were filled with doubt and fear. "You've always believed in me, Em. Ever since we were kids. You think I can do anything." "Because you can," she whispered, her throat tightening. Ryan shook his head, his jaw clenching. "What if I can't? What if I'm not enough?" The vulnerability in his voice shattered something inside her. "Ryan," Emma's voice was barely above a whisper as she leaned closer, her fingers tightening around his. "Why would you even think that?" Ryan's gaze dropped again, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Hi, Dad," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "He keeps pushing me to apply to engineering programs. Why, Stanford, all these top schools. But I don't even know if that's what I want." Emma's heart clenched. She had seen the way Mr. Bennett spoke about Ryan's future, like it was already decided. But she hadn't realized how deeply it was suffocating him. "Have you told him that?" she asked gently. Ryan gave a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "What's the point? He doesn't listen. He just assumes I'll follow the plan." Emma's throat tightened. "But it's your life, Ryan." "I know," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what if I mess it up? What if I don't live up to his expectations?" Emma's heart ached for him. She could see the battle raging inside him. The fear of failure, the weight of expectations, and the longing to follow his own path. "Ryan," she said softly, her hand gently cupping his cheek, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You don't have to be perfect." His eyes darkened, but there was a flicker of something else, something fragile and vulnerable. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," she whispered, her thumb brushing lightly against his skin. "It's okay to be unsure. It's okay to take your time." Ryan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers for something. Hope, reassurance, maybe both. "But what if I disappoint him?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's heart squeezed. She hated how much he was carrying on his shoulders, how much he was trying to be everything everyone expected. "You won't," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "And even if you do, that's not the end of the world. Your life, your happiness, that's what matters." Ryan's lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes were filled with so many unspoken emotions that Emma's chest felt tight just looking at him. "I'm scared, Em," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "What if I choose wrong?" Emma's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his words. "Then we'll figure it out," she whispered, her forehead brushing gently against his. "Together." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't suffocating. It was filled with unspoken promises and quiet understanding. Ryan's fingers slowly tightened around hers, as if grounding himself in her presence. "I missed you," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "I missed you too," she whispered, her lips almost brushing against his. For a moment time stood still. The space between them was charged, their breaths mingling as their eyes locked. But then Ryan pulled back slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know if I can fix everything," he murmured, his voice filled with uncertainty. Emma's fingers brushed against his cheek, her touch gentle and reassuring. "You don't have to fix everything, Ryan. Just let me be here with you. We'll figure it out. One step at a time." Ryan's eyes lifted to meet hers, And for the first time in a long time, Emma saw a glimmer of hope beneath the shadows. "Okay," he whispered. The next day felt lighter somehow. Emma wasn't sure if it was because Ryan had finally let her in, or if it was the hope that things were slowly starting to change. Either way, she found herself walking through the school halls with a sense of cautious optimism. Lily caught up with her by her locker, her eyes immediately scanning Emma's expression. "So?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity. Emma gave her a small smile, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I talked to him." Lily's eyebrows lifted. "And?" "He opened up," Emma said softly, her fingers brushing against the edge of her notebook. "But he's still scared. I think he doesn't know how to let go of the pressure his dad's putting on him." Lily's expression softened. "That's a lot for one person to carry." "Yeah," Emma murmured, her gaze drifting toward the window where cherry blossom petals danced in the breeze. "Are you okay?" Lily asked gently. Emma's lips pressed together and she gave a small nod. I don't know how to help him." "Sometimes," Lily said softly, "just being there is enough." Emma's eyes met hers and for a moment, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. By lunchtime Ryan was waiting for her. Emma spotted him sitting under the cherry blossom tree, the same one where they had made their promise all those years ago. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, sitting alone with a faraway look in his eyes. But this time, he was waiting for her. "Hey," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence as she approached. Ryan's eyes lifted and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Hey." Emma sat beside him, her shoulder brushing gently against his. "I didn't think I'd see you here." Ryan's gaze drifted to the petals falling around them. I figured it was time." "Time for what?" she asked softly. Ryan's lips pressed together and he exhaled slowly. "Time to stop running." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm still scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to push you away anymore." Emma's eyes softened as she reached for his hand, her fingers lacing gently with his. "Then don't," she whispered. Ryan's eyes met hers and for the first time in weeks, there was a quiet resolve in his gaze. "Okay," he murmured. And as they sat beneath the cherry blossom tree, their hands intertwined and their hearts beating in quiet unison, Emma knew. They were finding their way back to each other.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Whispers Beneath the Blossoms. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 3. Fractured Promises. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. Ryan and Emma had found their way back to each other, but the unspoken weight of everything they hadn't yet said still hung between them. Their friendship was mending, but it was fragile, like the petals of the cherry blossoms that floated through the air, beautiful yet fleeting. They spent more time together, slipping back into old routines that felt familiar yet different. Ryan had started walking Emma home after school again just like he used to. But now their conversations weren't as carefree as they once had been. There was an undercurrent of hesitation in Ryan's voice, a quiet uncertainty that Emma could feel every time he spoke about the future. And Emma, she didn't push. She gave him space, letting him navigate his thoughts at his own pace. But the more time they spent together, the more Emma realized that the walls Ryan had built around himself hadn't completely come down. It was on a cool Thursday afternoon under the shade of the cherry blossom tree that Emma finally sensed the shift. "Ryan, you okay?" she asked softly, her fingers gently brushing against his as they sat beneath the branches, their backpacks discarded beside them. Ryan had been unusually quiet, his gaze distant as he stared at the petals falling around them. "Yeah," he murmured, but the tightness in his voice told a different story. "Ryan," Emma pressed gently, her tone laced with concern. "Talk to me." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were filled with hesitation, but there was something else. Something that made Emma's stomach twist. "I got into MIT, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Ryan, that's amazing." But Ryan didn't look happy. His jaw clenched and he looked away, his fingers digging into the grass beside him. "It's what my dad wanted," he murmured, his tone hollow. Emma's chest tightened. What do you want? Ryan was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he was searching for an answer he couldn't find. I don't know, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I used to want it. But now, I'm not so sure. Emma's heart ached for him. Ryan, she whispered, her fingers gently brushing against his. You don't have to do this if it's not what you want. His lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. It's not that simple, Em. Why not? She asked softly. Because, he exhaled sharply, frustration lacing his voice. Because I don't want to disappoint him. Emma's throat tightened. You're not living your life for him, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and Emma saw the battle waging within him. The fear of letting his father down and the longing to follow his own path. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. I don't know how to tell him. Emma's fingers gently brushed against his, her touch grounding him. Then tell me, she whispered. Ryan's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. I don't want to go to MIT, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about applying to an art school. Emma's eyes widened slightly, but her heart swelled with pride. Art school, she echoed softly, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Ryan's lips curled into a small, hesitant smile. Yeah, he murmured. I love creating things. I've been sketching, painting. It's the only thing that makes me feel free. Emma's chest tightened with emotion. Ryan, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Why didn't you tell me? Ryan shrugged, his gaze dropping. I didn't think it mattered, he murmured. Not when my dad's been planning my future since I was 12. Emma's heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine what it was like, feeling trapped between his own dreams and his father's expectations. Of course it matters, she said softly, her fingers brushing against his hand again. What you want, it matters, Ryan. Ryan's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Emma saw a flicker of hope beneath the doubt. I'm scared, he whispered. I know, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But you don't have to do this alone. Ryan's fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment, the world felt a little less heavy. The next few days passed in a blur. Ryan's confession had opened a door between them, one that Emma had been waiting to walk through for a long time. But now that it was open, she realized how much work still needed to be done. Ryan was still hesitant, still unsure of how to confront his father. And Emma, she didn't have all the answers. But she was determined to be there for him no matter what. They spent more afternoons under the cherry blossom tree, talking about everything and nothing. Ryan opened up more than he ever had before, sharing his sketches with Emma, each one filled with so much passion and emotion that it took her breath away. You're incredible, Ryan, she whispered one afternoon, her eyes tracing the delicate lines of a cherry blossom branch he had drawn. Ryan's cheeks flushed slightly, but his lips curled into a shy smile. Thanks, Em, he murmured, his eyes filled with something Emma couldn't quite name. But as much as things were changing between them, there was still a lingering tension, an unspoken truth that neither of them had addressed. And it all came to a head on a quiet Saturday evening. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Emma and Ryan had been walking home from the local art supply store, where Ryan had picked up a new set of brushes. They walked side by side, their fingers brushing occasionally but never quite intertwining. The air was filled with the soft scent of cherry blossoms, and the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Ryan finally said, his voice breaking the quiet. Yeah, she murmured, her gaze lifting to meet his. Ryan's steps slowed and Emma followed suit, her heart pounding as he turned to face her. There's something I need to tell you, he said softly, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Emma's stomach twisted, a sense of dread curling in her chest. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting hers again. I think I'm falling for you, he murmured, his voice laced with vulnerability. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. Ryan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know I shouldn't, he continued, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But I can't help it. You've always been there for me, Em. And I don't know what I'd do without you. Emma's chest tightened, her emotions swirling in a chaotic mess. "Ryan," she whispered again, her throat tightening. "I don't expect you to say anything," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to know." Emma's heart pounded as the weight of his words settled over her. And for a moment the world stood still. Emma's heart pounded so loudly that she was sure Ryan could hear it. The weight of his words lingered in the air between them, pressing down on her chest like a heavy fog. "I think I'm falling for you." The confession echoed in her mind, making her knees feel weak. She hadn't expected this. Not now, not when things between them were finally starting to feel normal again. "Ryan," her voice was barely above a whisper, her throat tight as she searched his eyes for something, anything, that would make this moment less terrifying. But Ryan's gaze was steady, filled with uncertainty but also hope. "I know I shouldn't have said anything," he murmured, his jaw tightening as he looked away. I couldn't keep it in anymore." Emma's chest tightened. "Why do you think you shouldn't have?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's lips pressed together, his shoulders tense as he shoved his hands into his pockets. "Because," he let out a heavy sigh, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Because I don't want to lose you again." Emma's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice. "You're not going to lose me, Ryan," she murmured, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the boy she had known for so many years, the one who had always been by her side through everything. But what if this changes everything? Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper, his fear laid bare. Emma's throat tightened. "It doesn't have to," she murmured, her heart pounding. "Not if we don't let it." Ryan's gaze searched hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Do you?" His voice faltered, and Emma saw the hesitation in his eyes, the fear of rejection that he was trying so hard to hide. "Do you feel the same way?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. Did she? Her mind spun with memories of laughter beneath the cherry blossoms, of whispered secrets and late-night conversations, of Ryan's unwavering presence in her life. She had always cared about him more than she had ever admitted to herself. But this was different. It wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something deeper, something that had been quietly growing between them for years. Emma's voice caught, her emotions swirling in a chaotic mess. "Emma," Ryan whispered, his eyes filled with vulnerability. Her chest tightened as her gaze locked with his, and in that moment Emma knew. "Yes," she murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do." Ryan's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through the uncertainty. "You do?" Emma's lips curled into a soft, hesitant smile. "Yeah," she whispered, her fingers brushing against his. A slow, relieved smile tugged at the corners of Ryan's lips, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. But just as quickly as that relief came, a new wave of uncertainty crashed over Emma. "What happens now?" she murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's smile faded slightly, and Emma saw the hesitation return to his eyes. I don't know," he admitted, his gaze dropping for a moment. "I mean, we're both figuring things out." And he paused, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to mess this up, Em." Emma's chest ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Me neither," she whispered. Ryan's fingers gently brushed against hers, and for a moment the world seemed to slow. "Maybe," Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe we don't have to figure everything out right now." Ryan's gaze lifted to meet hers, and she saw the flicker of hope return. "Yeah." Emma nodded, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Let's just take it one step at a time," she murmured, her voice filled with quiet determination. Ryan's smile grew, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like they were on the same page, like they were finally moving forward together. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of cautious smiles and stolen glances. Ryan and Emma had agreed not to put a label on whatever was happening between them, not yet. But the shift between them was impossible to ignore. They spent more time together, falling into an easy rhythm that felt both familiar and new. They still sat beneath the cherry blossom tree after school, but now, there was a quiet intimacy in the way Ryan's shoulder would brush against Emma's or how his fingers would occasionally linger a little longer when they touched. But as much as things between them were changing, there was still an undercurrent of uncertainty beneath the surface. And that uncertainty came to a head one afternoon, a week after Ryan's confession. Emma and Ryan were sitting beneath the cherry blossom tree, the soft petals drifting around them as the late afternoon sun painted the sky in warm hues. Ryan was sketching again, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked on a new piece. Emma watched him, her heart swelling with affection as she took in the way his lips pressed together when he was focused, the way his fingers moved with such care and precision. "You're amazing, you know that?" she murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's cheeks flushed slightly, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Em," he murmured, his gaze still focused on his sketch. Emma's lips curled into a soft smile, but her heart was pounding. "Ryan," her voice was hesitant, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her sweater. Have you talked to your dad yet?" Ryan's hand paused and Emma saw the tension immediately return to his shoulders. "Not yet," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's chest tightened. "Ryan," she whispered softly, her gaze filled with concern. "I know," he murmured, his jaw tightening. I don't know how to tell him." Emma's heart ached for him. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered, her fingers gently brushing against his. Ryan's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he was trying so hard to hide. "What if he doesn't understand?" Ryan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll figure it out," Emma said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. Ryan's lips pressed together and Emma saw the battle waging within him, the fear of disappointing his father and the longing to follow his own dreams. "I'm scared, Em," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," she murmured, her fingers tightening around his. "But I'm right here. Always." Ryan's gaze softened and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. "Thanks, Em," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Emma's heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were truly facing this together. But just when it seemed like they were finally finding their way, everything fell apart.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Whispers Beneath the Blossoms. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 4. The Weight of Silence. The afternoon breeze carried the soft scent of cherry blossoms, but for the first time, Emma didn't feel comforted by it. The petals drifted lazily around her as she sat beneath the familiar tree, her sketchbook lying untouched in her lap. Her fingers traced absent patterns across the cover, but her mind was miles away. Ryan hadn't been at school that day. He hadn't answered her texts either. Her stomach twisted as she glanced at her phone for the 100th time, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. "Emma." She glanced up, startled by the sound of Lily's voice. Her friend stood a few feet away, concern etched across her features. "Hey," Emma murmured, forcing a weak smile as she tucked her phone away. Lily frowned, her gaze shifting to the empty space beside Emma. "Where's Ryan?" Emma's chest tightened. I don't know," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily's brow furrowed. "He hasn't been answering your texts?" Emma shook her head, her throat tightening. "Not since yesterday." Lily's expression softened as she sat down beside Emma, her shoulder gently brushing against hers. "What happened?" Emma's fingers tightened around the edges of her sketchbook as the memories came flooding back. Yesterday had been perfect until it wasn't. They had spent the afternoon together, tucked away beneath the cherry blossom tree, talking about everything and nothing. Ryan had seemed more at ease, the tension that usually shadowed his features replaced by a quiet contentment. "You know," Emma had murmured softly, her head resting lightly against Ryan's shoulder. "We should probably start thinking about that art contest." Ryan had chuckled, his fingers idly tracing patterns in the grass. "Are you saying we procrastinate too much?" Emma had smiled, her eyes drifting closed as she savored the warmth of the moment. "Just a little." For a moment everything had felt right. But then Ryan's phone had buzzed. He had pulled it out, his expression shifting the moment he saw the name flashing across the screen. His dad. Emma had felt the change instantly. The way Ryan's body had tensed, the way his smile had faded. "Ryan," she had murmured softly, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. But Ryan had already silenced the call, his jaw tightening as he shoved the phone back into his pocket. "Everything okay?" Ryan's gaze had dropped to the ground, his expression carefully guarded. "Yeah," he had murmured, but Emma had known better. "Ryan. I don't want to talk about it, Em." The finality in his tone had stung more than Emma had expected. "Okay," she had whispered, her heart sinking. They had spent the rest of the afternoon in strained silence, the easy comfort they had shared just moments before slipping through their fingers. And when they had finally parted ways, Emma had felt the distance growing between them like a chasm she couldn't cross. "Emma." Lily's voice pulled her back to the present, her concern still evident. "What happened?" Emma's throat tightened as she tried to find the right words. "I think," her voice faltered. "I think he's shutting me out again." Lily's expression softened. "Did you two fight?" "Not exactly," Emma murmured, her gaze dropping to her lap. "It's his dad. I think," she swallowed hard. "I think he's scared of disappointing him." Lily nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Ryan's always carried a lot on his shoulders," she murmured softly. "But shutting you out isn't fair." "I know," Emma whispered, her chest tightening. "But I don't want to push him." Lily was quiet for a moment before speaking again, her voice gentle. "Maybe he needs you to push a little." Emma's brow furrowed, her heart pounding. What if I push too hard?" Lily's gaze was steady, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "Then at least he'll know that you're not going anywhere." Emma's chest tightened as her mind spun with uncertainty. "I'm scared, Lily," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of what?" "Of losing him," Emma whispered, her throat tightening. Lily's expression softened as she reached out, her hand gently squeezing Emma's. "Then fight for him, Em," she murmured softly. "Don't let him pull away." Emma's heart pounded as she met Lily's gaze, the weight of her words settling deep within her chest. Could she do it? Could she fight for Ryan, even if it meant risking everything? Later that evening, Emma stood outside Ryan's house, her heart pounding so loudly that she was sure he'd hear it from inside. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she took a steadying breath. "You can do this, Em." Lily's words echoed in her mind, giving her the strength she needed. He had to try. Raising her hand, Emma knocked softly on the door. For a moment there was nothing. And then the door opened. Ryan stood there, his expression unreadable, but the tiredness in his eyes was impossible to miss. "Emma," his voice was barely above a whisper. "Hey," she murmured softly, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryan's gaze flickered with something, relief? Surprise. But then just as quickly he looked away. "What are you doing here?" "I was worried," Emma admitted softly, her throat tightening. "You weren't at school today. And you didn't answer my texts." Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze still averted. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan." Her voice was so soft, but it carried a weight that made him finally meet her gaze. "What's going on?" she asked gently, her eyes searching his. For a moment Ryan's guard wavered, and Emma saw the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I talked to my dad," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's chest tightened. "And?" Ryan's gaze dropped, his jaw clenched tightly. "He wants me to go to that business school," he whispered, his voice laced with a quiet bitterness. Emma's heart clenched. "But what about art?" Ryan's lips pressed together, and Emma saw the battle waging within him, the war between following his dreams and meeting his father's expectations. "I don't know, Em," he murmured softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do." Emma's throat tightened as she stepped closer, her fingers gently brushing against his. "You don't have to figure it out alone, Ryan," she whispered softly. Ryan's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of everything he was carrying. "I'm scared, Em," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's chest tightened as she squeezed his hand gently. "I know," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. Ryan's fingers tightened around hers, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like he wasn't pulling away. "We'll figure it out," she murmured softly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Together." But just as the moment settled between them, Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket. His dad. Emma felt Ryan's grip on her hand falter as he glanced at the screen, his expression hardening once more. "Ryan," Emma whispered softly, but the distance was already creeping back into his eyes. I need to take this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the fragile connection between them slipped away. Ryan's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear. His father's voice came through, calm but with the usual undertone of expectation that weighed heavier than any storm. "Ryan, I've been trying to reach you," Mr. Callahan's voice echoed softly, but it carried the weight of authority. "Yeah, I know. Sorry," Ryan murmured, his eyes avoiding Emma's. He took a step back, putting more distance between them. Emma's heart clenched as she watched the wall between them rebuild itself, brick by painful brick. "Where are you?" his father asked, his tone neutral but sharp. "Just outside," Ryan replied, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Ryan's jaw tightened. The business school. Emma could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched ever so slightly as if the weight was pressing down harder than before. I have," Ryan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "And?" His father's voice was firm, expectant. Ryan's fingers clenched the phone tighter, and for a moment, Emma thought he might say it, might finally tell his father that he didn't want business school. But instead he swallowed hard and said, I'm still thinking about it." Silence. The kind that made Emma's chest ache because she knew it wasn't just about this one conversation. It was the silence Ryan had been living in for years, trying to be what his father wanted, sacrificing pieces of himself to meet expectations that left no room for dreams. "Don't take too long," Mr. Callahan said finally, his tone making it clear that there was only one acceptable decision. "Deadlines are approaching." Ryan's throat bobbed as he nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. "I know." "Good." The line went dead and Ryan let out a slow, shaky breath before lowering the phone. Emma's heart twisted as she stepped closer. "Ryan." "I'm fine," he murmured, but the lie was too obvious, too practiced. "No, you're not." Emma's voice was soft but steady as she reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. "Please, talk to me." Ryan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the battle raging inside him. The need to open up warring with the instinct to keep everything buried. "I don't know what to do, Em," he whispered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions, and no matter which one I choose, I lose." Emma's chest tightened. "You don't have to choose alone," she murmured softly, her gaze steady. "I'm here, Ryan. I'm not going anywhere." His jaw clenched and Emma could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of being a disappointment, of losing everything. But what if choosing art means disappointing him? Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper, his walls crumbling. "Then maybe it's time to stop living for someone else's expectations," Emma said gently, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Ryan's gaze dropped, his fingers running through his hair in frustration. "It's not that easy, Em," he murmured. He's my dad. He's done so much for me. I don't want to let him down." Emma's heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. "I know," she whispered softly. "But what about what you want, Ryan? What about what makes you happy?" Ryan's gaze met hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the flicker of longing in his eyes, an ache for something more, something that felt real. "I don't even know what that looks like anymore," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet pain. Emma's throat tightened. "Then let's figure it out, together." Ryan's expression softened, and for the first time in days, Emma felt a small glimmer of hope. "Together?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Always," Emma whispered softly, her fingers gently lacing through his. For a moment they stood there in the quiet, the weight of the world pressing down on them, but together, it felt a little lighter. The next day at school, Ryan was distant again. Emma tried to brush it off, telling herself that maybe he just needed space. But her heart told her otherwise. By lunchtime he was nowhere to be found. "Any word from Ryan?" Lily asked softly as they sat under the cherry blossom tree. Emma shook her head, her fingers toying with the edge of her sandwich. "Nothing," she murmured, her chest tightening. Lily's gaze was filled with quiet concern. "Maybe he's just Processing everything, she offered gently. Maybe, Emma murmured, but the ache in her heart told her that something was wrong. Her phone buzzed and her heart leapt, until she saw the name. Mrs. Carter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she answered. Emma, sweetie. Mrs. Carter's voice was soft but laced with worry. Hi, Mrs. Carter, Emma murmured, her pulse quickening. Have you seen Ryan? Emma's stomach dropped. Not since last night, she admitted softly. Why? What's wrong? Mrs. Carter's voice wavered slightly. He didn't come home last night. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Wait, what? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He said he was going out for a walk, but he never came back, Mrs. Carter murmured, her voice filled with quiet fear. Emma's heart pounded in her ears. I'll find him, she promised softly, her throat tightening. Please, Mrs. Carter whispered. I will, Emma murmured, her voice filled with quiet determination. The sun was beginning to set by the time Emma found him. Her feet carried her instinctively to the place where everything had started. The cherry blossom tree. And there he was. Ryan sat at the base of the tree, his back against the trunk, his knees pulled up to his chest. His head was bowed and his fingers idly traced patterns in the grass. Ryan. His head lifted at the sound of her voice, and Emma's heart ached at the vulnerability in his eyes. She knelt beside him, her hand brushing gently against his. I was worried, she murmured softly. Sorry, he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's throat tightened as she saw the battle he was still fighting within himself. Talk to me, she pleaded softly. Ryan's gaze dropped, his jaw tightening. I don't know how to do this, he murmured, his voice laced with quiet pain. Do what? Be myself, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's heart ached as she gently cupped his face, her thumbs brushing against his cheeks. Then let's figure it out, together, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. Ryan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Emma saw the walls begin to crumble. Together, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Always, Emma whispered softly, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryan's fingers laced through hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel so alone. As the cherry blossoms drifted softly around them, Emma knew that the battle wasn't over. But this time, they would face it together.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You are listening to Whispers Beneath the Blossoms. Written by Akumah and voiceover by Cora.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 5, Blooming Hearts. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms that danced lightly on the breeze. Emma stood beneath the tree where she and Ryan had spent so many afternoons. The soft pink petals fell gently around her, like nature's quiet reassurance that change was inevitable, but sometimes change was beautiful. She hugged her jacket tighter around herself, her mind a swirl of thoughts. It had been a week since Ryan had finally opened up about his fears. Since then they had spent almost every evening together, talking, laughing, and slowly piecing together the fragments of what had been left unsaid for so long. But today felt different. Ryan was supposed to meet her here, but he was late. Emma glanced at her phone for the 5th time, her heart pounding just a little harder with each passing minute. Maybe he changed his mind. Her chest tightened at the thought. He had been so distant lately, even though he was trying so hard to be honest with himself. But she could feel the weight he was still carrying, the fear of disappointing his father, the uncertainty of choosing his own path. Come on, Ryan, she whispered under her breath, her fingers brushing against the petals scattered at her feet. Her heart leapt at the sound of his voice. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his expression hesitant but hopeful. Ryan, she breathed, her eyes softening as he stepped closer. Sorry I'm late, he murmured, running a hand through his hair in that nervous way he always did when he was unsure of himself. It's okay, Emma said softly, her lips tugging into a small smile. But something was different. There was a quiet determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The same vulnerability, but this time it was paired with resolve. Ryan's voice was softer now, almost hesitant. I need to tell you something. Emma's heart pounded in her ears as she nodded, her gaze never leaving his. Okay. Ryan took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the edge of his jacket as if grounding himself. I talked to my dad, he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Emma's breath caught in her throat. And, she asked softly, her heart pounding. Ryan's jaw tightened for a moment before he let out a slow exhale. I told him that I'm not going to business school. Emma's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Ryan. I told him that art makes me feel alive. That it's the only thing that's ever made sense to me, Ryan murmured, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting hers again. And that I can't keep living a life that isn't mine. Emma's throat tightened, her chest swelling with emotion. How did he take it? She asked softly. Ryan's lips pressed together, a flicker of pain flashing in his eyes. He didn't say much, he admitted quietly. I could tell he was disappointed. Emma's heart ached for him. But, Ryan's voice softened, and for the first time, there was a quiet sense of peace in his expression. I think, for the first time he saw me. The real me. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she stepped closer, her fingers brushing gently against his. Ryan. I don't know what's going to happen next, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I know I don't want to face it alone. Emma's heart clenched as her fingers laced with his. You won't, she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Ryan's gaze softened, his thumb brushing gently against her knuckles. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he murmured, his voice laced with vulnerability. Emma's lips tugged into a soft smile, her gaze unwavering. You showed me your heart, she whispered softly. And that's enough. The days that followed were different. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like he could breathe. It wasn't easy. His father's disappointment still lingered in the background, a quiet shadow that sometimes crept up on him when he least expected it. But it no longer consumed him. With Emma by his side, he had found a strength he didn't know he had. And as the days passed, that strength grew. They spent more time under the cherry blossom tree, sketching, talking, dreaming. Do you ever think about the future? Emma asked softly one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the clouds drifting lazily above them. Ryan's pencil paused mid-stroke, his lips tugging into a thoughtful smile. All the time, he murmured, his gaze shifting to her. Emma's eyes met his, and for a moment the world faded away. What do you see? She whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Ryan's gaze softened as his thumb brushed gently against her hand. I see us, he murmured, his voice laced with quiet certainty. I see you, by my side. Always. Emma's heart fluttered, her cheeks warming as her eyes searched his. And what else? She murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's lips curved into a soft smile. I see a small art studio, he murmured, his gaze distant but filled with quiet hope. With paint splatters everywhere, and sunlight streaming through the windows. Emma's lips tugged into a soft smile. And I see you, Ryan whispered softly, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. Laughing. Happy. Emma's eyes glistened as her heart pounded in her chest. Ryan. I don't know where life is going to take us, Em, he murmured, his voice filled with quiet vulnerability. But I know I want to face it with you. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she leaned closer, her forehead resting gently against his. Me too, she whispered softly, her voice barely above a breath. For a moment they simply stayed there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, as the cherry blossoms fell softly around them. And in that moment, everything felt right. But life had one more curveball to throw. A week later, Ryan's father called again. Emma was sitting next to him under their tree when his phone rang. Ryan's jaw tightened as he glanced at the screen, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He answered. Dad. Emma's fingers laced gently through his, offering silent support. Ryan. Mr. Callahan's voice was softer this time, less commanding. I wanted to talk. Ryan's brows furrowed as he exchanged a quick glance with Emma. Okay, he said softly. There was a long pause. I may not understand this path you've chosen, his father said quietly, his voice laced with something that sounded almost like regret. But I don't want to lose you over it. Ryan's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening in surprise. I still wish you'd reconsider, his father murmured, his voice softer now. But I also know that maybe I need to learn to let go. Ryan's throat tightened, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Dad. I'm proud of you, Ryan, his father said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the weight Ryan had been carrying for so long lifted. Tears burned at the back of his eyes as he squeezed Emma's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Thank you, he whispered softly, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. As the call ended, Ryan turned to Emma, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He's proud of me, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Emma's eyes glistened as she smiled softly, her fingers gently brushing against his cheek. Because you finally chose yourself, Ryan, she murmured softly. Ryan's lips tugged into a small, trembling smile. And I chose you, he whispered softly, his forehead gently resting against hers. A week had passed since Ryan's conversation with his father, and though the words were still fresh in his mind, the weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. Ryan stood in front of his canvas, sunlight streaming through the window of his makeshift art space in the corner of his room. The cherry blossoms outside swayed gently in the breeze, their petals brushing softly against the glass. His brush moved with ease as though his heart and hands were finally in sync. Every stroke was lighter, every color brighter. It wasn't just a painting. It was a reflection of everything he had felt in the past few months. The pain, the confusion, the fear. But also, the hope, the love, the promise of a future where he didn't have to pretend to be someone he wasn't. Ryan. Emma's voice was soft, but it filled the space with warmth. Ryan turned, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips as she stepped into the room. Hey, he murmured, setting the brush down carefully. Emma's gaze shifted to the canvas, her eyes widening slightly. Ryan, she breathed, her voice filled with quiet awe. The painting was breathtaking. A cherry blossom tree in full bloom, its branches stretching wide, petals caught mid-fall as if frozen in time. But at the base of the tree there were two figures, their silhouettes standing close, almost touching. The sunlight between them created a glow, making it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. It's us, she whispered softly, her voice barely above a breath. Ryan's cheeks flushed slightly, but his eyes held a quiet confidence. Yeah, he murmured, stepping closer. It's everything I feel when I'm with you. Emma's throat tightened, her heart pounding as she took in every detail. It's beautiful, she whispered, her eyes glistening. Ryan's fingers brushed gently against hers, his touch grounding her. I've never felt this free before, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It's like, I finally know who I am. And it's because of you. Emma's eyes softened, her lips tugging into a tender smile. You were always that person, Ryan, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet conviction. You just needed to believe it. Ryan's gaze lingered on her, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that words couldn't express. I love you, Emma, he whispered softly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. I love you too, Ryan, she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. And in that moment, everything faded away. Their lips met softly, the world falling silent as their hearts spoke in a language only they could understand. A month later, the annual spring art showcase at Ridgewood High was buzzing with life. Students and families wandered through the displays, marveling at the array of talent that filled the gymnasium-turned-gallery. Ryan stood near the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. His piece was displayed near the center of the room, where the light from the overhead fixtures illuminated it perfectly. The cherry blossom painting. Ryan. Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts, and when he turned, his breath caught. She was radiant, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, a soft pink dress that matched the petals in his painting hugging her frame. Wow, Ryan murmured, his eyes full of admiration. Emma's cheeks flushed, but her smile was bright. Are you ready? She asked softly, her hand reaching for his. Ryan took a steadying breath, his fingers lacing through hers. Yeah, he murmured, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. As they approached his painting, Ryan felt a wave of emotions wash over him. His father hadn't been able to attend, But Ryan knew that this moment wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about standing tall in his truth. "You did it," Emma whispered softly, her gaze fixed on the painting. Ryan's lips tugged into a small smile. "Oh, we did it." As they stood there hand in hand, a small group of people gathered around his painting. "This is stunning," one of the teachers murmured softly, her eyes filled with admiration. "Such detail and emotion," another parent whispered. Ryan's heart swelled with quiet pride, but it was Emma's soft squeeze of his hand that grounded him. "Ryan." A familiar voice echoed behind him, and Ryan's heart stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes widening when he saw his father standing a few feet away. "Dad." Mr. Callahan's expression was unreadable, but his gaze was fixed on the painting. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "This is..." His father's voice was softer than Ryan had ever heard it. "Incredible." Ryan's throat tightened, his emotions swirling. "Dad, I didn't think you'd come." Mr. Callahan's gaze finally met his son's, and for the first time, Ryan saw something in his eyes that he hadn't seen before. Pride. "I couldn't miss this," his father murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as his father stepped closer, his gaze softening. "I'm proud of you, Ryan," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's breath caught, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "Dad." Mr. Callahan's hand rested on his shoulder, a silent gesture that spoke louder than words. "I may not have understood it before," his father murmured softly. "But I see it now." Ryan's throat tightened, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Thank you," he whispered softly, his voice barely above a breath. Mr. Callahan's lips pressed into a small, proud smile. "You're going to do great things, son," he murmured softly. Ryan's eyes glistened as he glanced at Emma, her eyes filled with warmth and quiet pride. "I already am," he whispered softly, his fingers tightening gently around Emma's. And in that moment, Ryan knew that this was only the beginning. A few weeks later, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their petals swirling gently in the breeze as Ryan and Emma sat beneath their tree, the sunlight filtering through the branches. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Emma murmured softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Ryan's fingers brushed gently against hers, his lips tugging into a thoughtful smile. "All the time," he murmured softly, his voice filled with quiet warmth. Emma's gaze shifted to him, her eyes searching his. "And..." Ryan's smile deepened as he turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the quiet confidence that had blossomed within him. "I see us," he whispered softly, his voice barely above a breath. "I see a life where we're doing what we love. Together." Emma's heart swelled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me too," she murmured softly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. As their fingers laced together, the cherry blossoms swirled gently around them, a silent promise of new beginnings and endless possibilities. And in that moment, beneath the blossoms that had witnessed their journey, everything felt complete.
Akumah Audiobooks.
You have reached to the end of the story. Thank you for listening to Akumah Audiobooks. For more stories like this, refer to channel playlist and stay tuned by subscribing to the channel.